So tonight we're considering part 5 and 6, and I think we're getting to a moment, at least chronologically, that is very close to all of us as militants, as Marxists. Um, some of us consider ourselves activists, others don't. Those are just labels after all. But precisely the revival of Western Marxism is initiated in 2011 through Arab Spring and the Occupy movement. And Losurdo will basically point out that the leading celebrity Marxists, because now we have the problem of the celebrity media intellectual, which will, uh, you know, bring with it a whole series of issues regarding ultimately a pacification regarding the critique of imperialism, because a celebrity Marxist intellectual would not be a celebrity if they had a strident anti-imperialist position, right? So Slavoj Žižek, Alain Badiou, David Harvey, a whole range of folks coming out of the Sartrean orientation from critique of dialectical reason are put under consideration. So let us begin with Žižek, who we all know probably too well for our own good. It's interesting and powerful, I think, that Losurdo begins his critique of Žižek with a reference to In Search of Lost Causes, which is his most Marxist text. Yeah. In that text, I'll give you an example of what I mean. Žižek makes a split, right, between libertarian Western Marxism and authoritarian state capitalism of China. And this is a division that he has worked with as he's become less Marxist and really abandoned Marx over the last 15 years. That split is still one that he thought and initiated in the early 2000s, of thinking these two like a kind of wedge in the left at a civilizational level, you could call it. And one of the interesting things he says, to his credit, in this text from, I think, 2008, if I'm not mistaken, In Search of Lost Causes, maybe earlier, is that the West, the liberal, libertarian, Marxist West, wants to revise. He recognizes that they want to revise classical Marxism, right? So instead of the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, you get the self-organized and decentralized multitude, right? And collaboration amongst multiple agents. He talks about how Western Marxism is kind of a hyper-liberalism. This is Žižek here. And that it juxtaposes its own understanding of itself off of a totalitarian other, right? So in a certain way, this is also why Losurdo is pointing out that Žižek has some fidelity to the revolutionary tradition, which I think that he does, right? At the same time, there is in Žižek, and I searched down the sources on this in his work because I'm very familiar with it. There is what we might say a distinction that Slavoj makes between imperialism as a outmoded, including Lenin's theory of imperialism as a theory of history, as well as like the subjective condition of imperialism, such that he thinks, similar to Hart and Negri, that imperialism refers to a social relation of domination, not exploitation, and that the vast majority of citizens in the world are not succumb to domination. So therefore, in Žižek's view, you could say it's anachronistic to still insist that imperialism is an organizing principle of late capitalism or contemporary capitalism. So clearly what this creates a problem for Losurdo, because while Losurdo recognizes that imperialism in its classical form is an exception, it's not the rule, yeah, the cost of theorizing it as totally absent results in a type of idealism in which, during the revival of Western Marxism in 2011, what was also happening that year was the assassination of Gaddafi and all of these sort of covert imperialist occupations, largely in the Middle East, the fallout from the Iraq War, the repressive turn in the Arab Spring, et cetera, et cetera. None of that I mean, that is theorized by Žižek, but not vis-a-vis a theory of imperialism. So I think Losurdo is right to point that out. He then links immediately to Alain Badiou, and where Badiou goes awry or becomes a problem in Losurdo's framework is very quite interesting, actually. Now, the citation that Losurdo makes to Badiou is to two texts. One is like an essay, and one is called The Century, which some of you may be familiar with. I think it's a series of lectures. But just for folks that want to know more about Alain Badiou, after Derrida wrote this very famous text called The Ends of Man, he organized a convening in Paris in the early 90s, maybe late 80s, and Alain Badiou gave a text called Can Politics Be Thought? And it is in this text, translated by Bostiels and released just a few years ago in English, you will find the most systematic overhaul of Marxism. And just to give you a sense of the picture of Marxism after Badiou is done with it in this text, what we have is basically the reduction of Marxism to an anti-statist hypothesis, to a wager, right? And to what Badiou calls the development of a subtractive politics in which revolutionary or militant activity is theorized as very rare, and that the world itself, like the kind of modern Western world, is one in which freedom, and what we might say from before in our last session, the grand Hegelian dialectic of self-emancipation, of a group, etc., is understood to have withered. Not in the same ultra-pessimist way that we see in negative dialectics a la Adorno, but just open up the preface to The Logics of Worlds, 2006 text, and you'll see that Badiou basically makes an argument that the human is reduced to the status of an animal, but an animal not as Marx theorized the human animal, which he did in the 1844 manuscripts, that is of a pure subjection, which is made in distinction to a bourgeois subject, right? No, the human animal for Badiou is a kind of subject devoid of an idea. It's a subject only that can only think bodies and languages, right? So it's this sort of subject deprived of a reason to live, of a raison d'être, of a kind of a true commitment to an idea. Now, you could accuse Badiou of ultra idealism, of a primitive communism, and so on, and many people have done that. Although if you read Badiou carefully enough, you'll realize that it's a little bit more complex than that. Because like Foucault, it's difficult to give a passing critique of Badiou given the depth of his thought. But what I think is most interesting about what Losurdo says regarding Badiou is the fact that he basically falls in line with Isaiah Berlin's theory of freedom, which you know that distinction between positive and negative freedom, freedom from and freedom to. In a sense, Losurdo says, and I think this is interesting, I want to hear what others think about this, refuse to conflate justice with freedom, which is how historically the workers' movement and subsequent struggles for the emancipation of women, for the emancipation of Black slaves, for the emancipation of colonized subjects, have always thought freedom conflated with justice. The problem is that in this postmodern arrangement, Badiou is separating freedom from justice, and he's making the task of militancy about the ascertainment of the idea of justice. So let me give you an example of this where it becomes problematic. It becomes problematic when Badiou, and this is something we see also tragically also in CLR James, witness the movement of the Solidarity movement in Poland. I don't know how familiar you are with this. It's a very seminal event. It became a moment where you had a classical working class movement that was against the state socialism of the USSR. So all of its slogans, all of the organization was an imitation of Leninism, but against actually existing state socialism. Badiou, when he saw this, he argues, along with his comrades Sylvie and Lazarus, two great French Maoists, that Leninism, as a form of doing militant politics, had, to use their words, saturated itself. Leninism basically had saturated itself, which means that as a doctrine for the liberation of the proletariat, we now have to extract its lessons and apply them differently than we did under what they call the mode of doing politics as Lenin had it available to him. And that is why Badiou argues that politics that seeks to rival what he calls the capitalist parliamentary world system must be subtracted from that system, right? So you have the development of a kind of similar to Deleuze, and I think that Deleuze becomes very pivotal for Badiou here, a type of minoritarian, subtractive, nomadic politics. Keep in mind, one of Badiou's criticisms of the Yellow Vests had everything to do with his critique of the nomadic proletariat. He thinks the nomadic proletariat, which is an interesting assemblage, by the way, is the most revolutionary, right? He thinks, in some sense, that labor aristocracy internal to the core regions has rendered any revolutionary agency of the working class to be completely kaput, to be over. Yeah. So read Can Politics Be Thought to get a sense of the gravity of this. I could say just one little quote from it to give you a feel. He says, today, neither socialist states nor national liberation struggles, nor the workers' movement constitutes historical reference anymore. They no longer constitute historical reference that might be capable of guaranteeing the concrete universality of Marxism. This is why in Isabel Garo's Communism and Strategy, she both criticizes and praises Badiou, which is that Badiou exists within the French intellectual milieu as a celebrity intellectual. He wrote a book on Sarkozy that was a bestseller in France. He's frequently on French television debating all kinds of people from across the political spectrum. And he is a dinosaur of the 68 generation. I've done several programs on his take on 68, right? Whereby you have to always read Badiou as retaining some type of purity of Marxism in a time of great liberal reaction, to his credit. That is why he thinks that kind of like expressions of Marxist politics that would rely on the referent to national liberation, to a workers' struggle, or to have some fidelity to a socialist state will contaminate the purity of Marxism, because the mode of doing politics that could be capable of producing something revolutionary has saturated in those three modes: national liberation, state socialism, and the workers' movement. But this is not put forward through the lens of a pessimist resignation a la Adorno, whereby the task of the intellectual is basically to become untimely and to be a critic. This is put forward through a careful strategy for a politics that organizes different subject groups. And that, he develops a whole sophisticated theory of organization out of this. So yes, please, Aaron.
Yeah, so just jumping off of this, I wanted to ask you more specifically. I'm not myself all that familiar with Badiou's work. I haven't read that much of it. I haven't read any of the books. But I wanted to ask you kind of about that second piece, which is like he has his criticism of the kind of lack of reference. But then I'm curious about his kind of solution to that problem, because Losurdo uses this term populism fairly liberally, I think. And I think I mentioned before that my background is in populism studies. And so I think that for instance, for Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, like they also come up with this. I think they come to similar conclusions about the role of the proletariat and things like that. And they develop this theory about a kind of chain of equivalence, and this is what we call like left populism today. That basically you need to link up in a kind of chain movements for environmental struggles, for gender struggles with the proletariat. In other words, they reject the proletariat as the kind of engine of history. And it sounds to me like you're saying that you think something similarly, that at this historical conjuncture, neither the proletariat nor kind of a national liberation struggle nor can be an adequate referent for the left. And so I'm curious if this term populism is applicable to him or where he kind of fits in that kind of typology, if you see what I mean.
This is a good question because he also rejects the multitude theory. In other words, he doesn't think that spontaneous social movements a la Harta Negri or a la Laclau and Mouffe will provide the goods for a renewed Marxism. But the whole notion of the communist hypothesis has to do with this idea of a refoundation of what is most novel regarding Marxism. And the conclusion that he arrives at is that if Marxism has historically withered of its mode of potency, its capacity to generate a political change has withered. This is why people may know about this debate that he had with Negri, where he said, Negri, you are a Marxist first and a communist. I'm a communist first and a Marxist second, right? It has to do with this notion of the preservation of communism as a wager on behalf of a subject that is thought to be rare. Their existence is thought to be rare. It's not so much that events are thought to be rare. Events happen all the time. For Badiou, he's a thinker of how events become organized, often retroactively by subjects. And so he has this sort of, this is the basis of his philosophy, yeah? And to some extent, you're right. I mean, he is an interesting figure. I mean, Losurdo wants to say, similar to Žižek, that he also has a refusal or an ignorance regarding the colonial subject. And I think to some extent that is true, but also untrue in the sense of Badiou's longstanding allegiance to French Maoism. Where it is true, though, I think, is that Badiou's conception of history through the development of what he calls these revolutionary moments of periodization becomes a way for him to and this is one of the most interesting things about Badiou, I think, to re-theorize the entirety of Marxist revolutionary thought. And like Ernst Bloch, which we've talked about before, Badiou will make an argument, right? That what's most novel in the history of communism, not Marxism per se, is the affirmation of these rare subject groups that affirm an anti-property and anti-statist rebellion against the status quo. And then from that affirmation, they then subsequently organize a new reality that then shapes and changes the world. So this is partially why he was so interested in the Arab Spring, in these movements, because he saw them as expressive of this fundamental egalitarian wager. Right? So politics for him is about that's what the communist hypothesis is. It's the expression of a radical egalitarianism. You could say even of an impossible egalitarianism. And so the task of the militant, and it's interesting because Losurdo is constantly saying that Marxist intellectuals are not empirical. Like, look at their desks. Do they have the papers of the news and the current events on their desks? Are they concerned? But we know from Maoism that one of the big things of Maoism is the notion of the inquiry. So Maoism has that empiricism. And Badiou's always been like that, by the way. So I don't think you could really quite critique him like that. You'd see my point. His system is very much premised on the idea that liberalism is totally triumphant And our best chance for communist future is to organize experimental renegade groups on the margins. Again, this kind of goes back to the Deleuzian thing. And that he even often compares that with what the Bolsheviks, who the Bolsheviks were, which I think is slightly problematic. Deepika, please.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that conversation and say that basically it's about supporting, all revolutionary movements, against the present order. That's what I think that he seems to be suggesting, without having any particular pecking order, but basically it's kind of, acknowledging the disruptions that are happening.
Yeah, exactly. It's I mean, here is what Badiou has to say regarding national liberation, right? Which I found interesting. He says, after the war in Vietnam, as subsequent developments have shown, what nationalism was still capable of in terms of inventions adapted to the conditions of the time. It has proven that the bourgeois era of national wars not only was not over, but also had the potential for political and military innovation. So this is the key point. Okay. He understands the thrust of the anti-colonial revolutions as bourgeois revolutions. You see the point? That's very different than Losurdo, right? That distinguishes them heavily, right? But that has to do with, I think, his judgment on the state of communist China today, right? And also Badiou's own theory, which is not nearly as developed or refined as Losurdo's, of what is liberalism, right? So, and also this notion of this very French theory of periods of history based on this notion of scansion and subtraction that he gets from Lacan, such that periods of history literally like break epistemologically from prior periods. You see? So the novelty of experimentation when Lenin was the primary theoretician, Lenin's no longer the primary theoretician in our mode, in this situation that we find ourselves in. Badiou is always a thinker of situations. So it is an unabashedly post-Leninist framework, okay? Oh, hello, Conrad, jump in.
Hi, yeah. So, obviously there's a lot to like about this text, though I did find that in the latter part of the book, I was a little bit disappointed by how schematic a lot of the comments were. Because the book's called Western Marxism, not Western Marxism and the Colonial Question. And while I don't want to trivialize that, since it's I don't want to trivialize that. I thought that there was sometimes a lack of perspective that was brought to some of the thinkers, in the latter section of the book. And I think, it's interesting when you talk about Badiou, because, there's been many critiques which have been leveled at Badiou over time, some good, some not so good. But it seems to me that, and I think you've sort of inferred this when you're talking, that a lot of the features of his system, right, even features that one might construe as problematic, so many of them reflect the character of capitalism in our time, right? So for example, like this sort of subtractive idea, right, that a movement would have to kind of come from without, right, and oppose itself to the overarching social order, right? And even if we make the contrast with Leclau and Mouffe, right, I think we can kind of see the two poles of the way that Marxist discourse functions in our time. So, with Leclau and Mouffe, you have this idea of attempting to construct like a new hegemony, right, through the rallying together of different social movements that, I think many have observed risks lending itself to a kind of non-revolutionary parliamentarism, and perhaps has, should we survey the development of left populism over the past few years. And in that respect, we could perhaps draw an analogy with the role that Gramscianism played, right, for the Italian Communist Party, right, in its moment of deepened reformism after World War II. And then, on the other hand, we have Badiou, right, where, he's not he's much more conscious, right, of the risk of cooptation in a sense than Laclau and Mafar. But again, at the cost of a certain kind of subtraction from reality. And I know that that's not a static point because, you know, even being an event, right, logic of worlds can be read as a kind of a corrective to it, right, with respect to the potential messianism of the way that the event functions. But to give you an example, I just wanted to give an example because I think it's an interesting one. You know, if we talk about Negri and Hart, if we talk about empire, I think it's, you know, very legitimate to say that a lot of the conclusions the book reaches are kind of over hasty and sweeping. And yet, I think at the same time, we can understand, you know, what within social reality kind of motivates those approaches, right? So if we look at, you know, the dismissal of a more traditional theory of imperialism, it's like, well, you know, yeah, okay. If we look internationally, you know, it remains the case that there's, you know, unequal exchange of labor units in the world market, and that this is political, and so forth. And yet, at the same time, we can see that if you look at the exportation of jobs from the United States, you know, and the hollowing out of the working class there, you know, that this has created a certain level of equalization in terms of international conditions, right? And there's been a general proletarianization that we can see that's quite wide. You could say the same of the way that they approach value, right? Because they sort of have the idea that, you know, you can't use the labor theory of value because, you know, value is being generated everywhere all the time. Now, you know, again, that is premature, right? Like, why would someone like Macron be fighting for extending the work week, for example, right? You know, if this sort of more finite conceptualization of value had no validity. But at the same time, it's like, you know, if we look at the internet, for example, right, and the way the data functions, right, we can see that there's been a tremendous, you know, penetration of value creation, you know, into different spheres of even what would have been previously construed as just leisure time, right? So I think that again, this was sort of my, you know, something that, again, I don't want to. I think the text has plenty of value, but this was something I found that was maybe conspicuously lacking in some of its later parts.
Yeah.
Was an consideration in that way.
No, I think it's really good. I mean, I think you know there's the two temporalities that we will develop. There's the four acts of thinking revolution in Marx and Engels that I want to throw onto the table, and how the two Marxisms, right? I mean, I also would like to know if folks are even like sort of like comfortable or, you know, even convinced of this notion of the two Marxisms, and how the two Marxism may or may not still be operative today, since we are talking about our present. But one of the things I do want to just review is this question about power and the aversion to power across Western Marxism. Part of what Losurdo doesn't say about this has to do with, famously, 68 thought. And it's surprising to me that Jean Baudrillard is not a interlocutor in this text, when I think that he should be, because he demonstrates and could really support and bolster a lot of Losurdo's arguments. I'll give you an example. In a text right after 68, Baudrillard said, May 68 produced, I'm reading Baudrillard here, produced a soft turn within Marxism, and thereby turned Marxism on its head by defining those who are truly radical by those who believe in their labor power versus those who do not. The truly radical position was to be against one's own labor power. It was to be against the creeping social reproduction of labor and against the traditional proletariat on the side of production. They become the boogeyman, the reactionary. That's Baudrillard. That explains to me more clearly than the theory of the sort of PMC intellectual whose conditions of scholarship and critique rely on them not touching power. Because that's actually a specific theorization regarding a new praxis. 68 thought praxis was that, in some sense, formed off of an opposition to a theory of power vis-a-vis labor power and production and so on, right? So that was interesting to me. I think the other point that is undeveloped in Losurdo, but albeit interesting, is the thing which we mentioned before, but I want to invite Sartreans or anyone who's read the Critique of Dialectical Reason to weigh in on this, which is why is it, right, that the fused group, the theory of the revolutionary group, right, from the Jacobins through the modern period is thought to become scandalized by power in Sartre's framework.
So, Daniel,
Please.
yeah, I mean, I had a lot of difficulty when I was reading that section. And my analysis of this was that, it seems to me that the East is only of interest, as long as it's struggling and it's struggling for a voice. And therefore, freedom and emancipation and all of that, is basically romanticized. But the actual freedom, when you empower yourself, when you are in charge of power, that is not a realization that some of them are comfortable with.
Yes, exactly. And
Yeah.
it's complex in a certain way because I think that there is, this Derridian notion of autoimmunity. Like it's kind of playing out here in the sense that a lot of thinkers will recognize that they themselves fetishize, in the case of American Marxist intellectuals, South America, where real revolution is still happening far away, right? This is like Zizek's critique of Hartenegri, by the way, right? Which was Hartenegri ultimately romanticized revolution of the third world, of the global South, and so on, right? And then the critique then was, well, you need to become better about poor region working class politics. And what I found interesting, Deepika, about that shift and transposition was that it came at this sort of marginalization of
Yeah.
one or the other. It's like this thing we talked about before of this weird imposed hierarchy on liberation struggles. You know what I mean? So what I'm trying to say to you is that there's a certain awareness of this romanticization and almost even a recognition of its deadlocks, right? In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is that I think if Adorno was here with us today, in some sense, he would be capable of recognizing, which is why the quote that Losurdo brings out from Negative Dialectics, that praxis has been abandoned for our time. And therefore a whole new vocation of reading Hegel must emerge, I mean,
But
in some sense, a very minimalist critique of Adorno's Negative Dialectics, which definitely wants you wanting more. But
Yeah.
at the same time, he's doing it from a high vantage point, and it therefore then makes sense. It makes sense that the task then, the danger then, would be to conceive of the party form and the intellectual's task as just critique, right? As just critique caught within this temporality that has no interest in seizing power, no tolerance for existing socialist experiments, etc.
Yes, correct. And also that, the East can only be a place of struggle, and it cannot be a place, that takes control. So this is all very troubling, when you read this and you read, between the lines of, what this philosophy is actually doing. It's really troubling.
Yeah, Losurdo says that it develops a sense of, well, a sort of limited mode of critique, not philosophy. So a philosopher is a Hegelian philosopher. That's a philosopher for Losurdo, and that means that it's a philosopher who inserts themselves within their present with a very particular aim of thinking concrete universality, determinate negations as caught up within our conjuncture, not as deferred, not as sort of recoiled from them or anything like that. And he makes the reference to Horkheimer's desk as Horkheimer not having any interest in the present, which I found very interesting. But I mean, I think, this messianism, this sense that Marxism becomes a religion, the intellectual becomes a prophet. What I think is interesting, if you examine the world in our present now, I would contend that that function is no longer valorized by the professional managerial class and the academic. In other words, I think we have seen something like the death of the prophet Marxist intellectual who's capable of being celebrated by the liberal intelligentsia. I wonder if others agree with that. Conrad.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to meditate a little bit upon your the proposal you just put forth because it was just like that. But I mean, I suspect that it's, I think even if you look at someone like Žižek, he's had a fair bit of appreciation, perhaps not from, liberals across the spectrum, but I think from different progressive elements in the population. I suspect that the issue relates more to what you mentioned earlier, right? Which is, I think implicitly the replacement of the party form, right? As a kind of medium for generating intellectuals, with a kind of mediatic discourse, which is increasingly guided by algorithms and things of this nature, right? Which, on one hand, we don't have partisan repressions, but we also don't have the discipline and connection to the people that someone like Althusser, for example, would always stress as the reason he chose to remain within the PCF, right? Whatever its deficiencies. But yeah, I mean, I just want to say about the text. I mean, I think part of what emerges as the issue, I think it's to talk about the valorization of the East only when it's struggling, or the South, or however we wish to characterize this, only when it's struggling, but not when it's able to coalesce, right? Into a more static state of governance. I mean, that to me has definite validity. But I also think that there's a limitation to that as a mode of critique. So we could take the example of China, right, which is going to loom really heavily in any discussion like this. I don't think that one can, dismiss the achievements of the Chinese state. I don't think that one can dismiss, 800 million people raised out of poverty, judged by World Bank standards, nor, a regime that, strongly uses capital controls and continues to maintain this ideology in many respects. Nevertheless, if we look at, the history of China, we can see that there's been a progressive shift rightward that mirrors, right, the collapse of socialist energies throughout the world, right? So the first major debate in China is, do we have, a more messianic Marxism, or do we have a kind of more bureaucratic iteration of it akin to the Soviet Union, right? The second debate is, do we have, the public sector, right? Even in its bureaucratic iteration, or do we have more the private sector? More recently, of course, there's no debate, right, about, the centrality of the private sector. That's widely accepted. I think what's more being disputed is it going to be half the economy which is public, or 25%, right? So we see this, conservative arc. Again, I think it's unambiguously clear that, their revolution, their period of delinking, are in any event absolutely crucial to any assessment, even of the function of the market today and the way it's been able to enrich Chinese people. But if we were just to say, right, that, these regimes are doing really well, right, they've succeeded, right, we need to valorize that, we're losing sight, right, of these potential regressions, and the need to situate them with respect to global events and to find something new. And I think this really relates to a kind of crisis of positivity within the text. So even at the end, and when the book says, how Western Marxism, what is it? How it can be fixed or something is the subtitle. How it can be, yeah, reborn. Yeah, but like, there's not a lot of, as some critics have pointed out, there's not a lot of constructive suggestions. Most of the book is dedicated to showing that Western Marxism is kind of fatally, affected by its indifference toward the colonial question. At the end, it sort of gestures vaguely toward, well, these different conditions do prevail, in the East and the West, and, Western Marxism in its specificity might have some purchase on that. But I don't think it provides a sufficiently comprehensive positive vision.
Well, I think I would slightly push back on that in the sense that, I mean, he makes two general arguments for the rebirth of Western Marxism. One is historiographical, which meaning that the history of the 20th century and the way that its struggles still inform us today needs to recenter the colonial question. Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
Number two, there is a way to move out of the sort of messianic temporality of Western Marxism and become fused with what he calls the anti-colonial revolution in its second stage. And I think here you're right to point to the fact that the Communist Party in China and so on may not be so welcoming to truly revolutionary Marxist intellectuals, right? Whether they be academic or organic at the end of the day. That's not to say that this should not be done, but I mean, that's his other point, which is we need to go easier. Like Badiou is big on like communism must be a politics of experimentation. Losurdo's point is that, well, yeah, that experimentation is still ongoing and it's connected to a whole different arc of revolutionary history, right? So it's also this implication of a new Marxist historiographical framework that he's trying to put on, which is why he's saying, fine, you want to talk about the conflation between Nazism and Bolshevism as two totalitarianisms. Let's talk about pre-World War II Theodore Roosevelt American racialized apartheid as a precursor to Nazism. What's the difference between the two, right? Which I think hits much more resonantly than Jason Stanley, who also makes the same point as a liberal, but not as a Marxist. Yeah. Like I can resonate more with Losurdo on this level when he makes that point, you know, because I know that there's a true praxis behind what he has to say here. Whereas Stanley does not have one, in my view. I think the other point is around the vocation of the Marxist intellectual that Losurdo wants to point out, which is pretty good. Having to do with this materialist relationship to philosophy, right? So a materialist philosophy. And there's a new text coming out soon, according to Rockhill, on the meaning of communism, where Losurdo digs into this a lot more. It should be out soon, or at least translated. You know, it's this point of the young Marx that we do not formulate our principles detethered from existing struggles. You know? Well, if you take that as a maxim, as a Marxist, which you should, how can you do that and ignore the world of existing former colonialist socialist states? That makes sense to me not to ignore them. Andrew, please.
Hey, Daniel, can you hear me? All right. That was a lot of good points, and I think you kind of hit the nail on, at least on what I was speculating, because really what I wanted to comment on was your question, like how does this notion of Western Marxism versus Eastern Marxism like sit with all of us? And I was actually listening to Gabriel Rockhill's lecture on these, sort of synopsis of the book, and he says like, and I'm not sure if like I'm just like repeating what everybody said in the past 3 lectures, which I've been listening to on the sidelines, but that it's not so much like a sort of like geographical division, but that it seems like these Western Marxists that Losurdo is critiquing are the ones that sort of have a privilege based on what Lenin would describe as a labor aristocracy. And I think that's sort of the one thing that he sees that the Eastern Marxist front isn't doing, but at the same time, they're also adhering to what Lenin would, talk about in concern of the both national and colonial question. But then also, I think one of the things, and this is just my speculation, reading, because I feel like this book isn't like this sort of magnum opus or the final thing. I feel like this is kind of like, if it's funny you brought up Jean Baudrillard, that people say like, oh, simulacrum simulation, that's not the one you should read. That's like, you have to read everything prior to that before you read this. It seems like you have to read everything Losurdo has written before in order to read this. And I'm reading the class struggle text, and I think he aligns the fact that these Marxists that are, materially embedded with struggle understand that class struggle has the species and genus aspect that Marx pointed out, and that there's both the national land liberation question, the colonial struggle within class struggle, and the one on private property and marriages. And I think that for these messianic and romanticized Western Marxists, they kind of homogenize class struggle into a sort of, workers' fetishism, to put it bluntly, or just this sort of romanticized abstract version of class. If I were to kind of bolster up and steelman Losurdo's, argument.
No, I mean, I think the labor aristocracy theory, when applied as Badiou often does, it shuts down his thinking with a movement like Gilets Jaunes, the Yellow Vests. It shuts it down completely because the Yellow Vests were split, right? There was like a kind of racist version of it and a much less racist version of it. Whereas Badiou's polemics against them seem to mostly castigate their movement as anachronistic or as reactionary and so on, which I thought was against his experimental spirit, in my view. I think the other thing we should mention here are the 4 temporalities, just very quickly. I think they're useful. Losurdo says there's the future in action, this idea of from on the Jewish question and the Grundrisse, which is basically a very pretty common idea in Marx, right? Which is the form of emancipation that bourgeois society does unto itself, right? That's number 1. That's the first layer. This is a non-capitalist future, which is pregnant, internal to bourgeois society already. Now, many Marxists will make a fatal error of overjudging the degree to which bourgeois society is capable of taking this pregnancy to, the 9th month, as it were, and we don't need to do anything because bourgeois society is already setting the ground for us and so on. Number 2, there's a conception of revolution in Marxism which thinks of what he calls the near future, which is a transitionary mode best typified in the critique of the Goethe program, right? In which the transcendence of capitalism and wage slavery is now finally put on the table vis-a-vis a seizure of the parliamentary apparatus in some way, right? Dictatorship of the proletariat, etc., right? And then there's these 2 other modalities, which is what he calls the remote future and the utopian future. So the remote future is the stage of this careful, pragmatic, compromised, experimental stage after a socialist power has gained power. The utopian future is the final one, which would, and this is true of Marx, posit something like an end to classes and so on. It's that final 4th one that Western Marxism latches its temporality onto with a complete abandonment of level 2 and level 3. That's, I think, how you could think of it. Okay, I'll stop. Deepika, please.
I just wanted to go back and respond to, the argument around China. And I think what I was thinking about it a little differently. One is, I think we are trained to only accept, some revolutions, and they should have a certain form. And, what the Chinese are doing is, in a way, from their perspective, redefining what a communist society will be. It'll be a communist society with Chinese characteristics, and that's what it looks like. That might be unusual to us, you see, and that's not what we are expecting. But I want to go by how they are defining, what they are doing, and not how we want to define it as outsiders. I think that's also a really important point, because one thing that struck me that Losurdo does, which is really, kind of made me think a lot. He talks about the French Revolution of 1789 and about that, as a really important moment. And then he says 2 years later, there was another big moment, which was 1791. And he says, this is the Haitian Revolution. And there's, kind of like, just lost that moment. So that's the thing. We are picking and choosing, what revolution is a revolution, right? What overthrow, is really considered an overthrow and controlled by the people. So considering that, we don't even have a consistent history. Within 2 years, there's one revolution the whole world celebrates, and the next one, which is also a huge moment, is the first decolonial moment. And people have almost forgotten about it, unless, in some circles you study that. So I think that kind of, really made me think that how are we defining, what the Chinese are doing? Is that communism? Is that not communism? Is that, which was going back to what I was talking about the first day when I was in Germany, people wanting me to define, are you a Trotskyite or are you this, are you that? And I said, no, none of that. It's not for you to define what kind of a Marxist I am. So you see, that's what I'm saying. There are ways in which they want to box you, and everything needs to be boxed. And not in a box that we already recognize, it doesn't belong here. Then it can be something peripheral. 1791 is peripheral as a revolution.
Exactly. And that's why I felt that this claim, right, that freedom is no longer the same as justice.
No.
As a claim regarding the victory of bourgeois society. That's what that means, right? Which means that for the vast majority of the world, say, and for Badiou, right? The old battle for recognition, as we articulated the last time in the grand Hegelian form, is off the table, right? I mean, it's a rare thing which we have to reignite the desire for it, right? So it becomes this process, and then of course Badiou also then, as all philosophers, then implies a whole new vocation for what it means to be a Marxist intellectual, if that's the case, what you're capable of advocating and so on. You have a fundamental distance from the vast majority of actually existing politics.
Correct.
Yeah. So Evie, please. Thank you for that, Deepika.
Yeah, we've been in the Discord sort of having a long ongoing conversation about BRICS and its relation to the colonial question and to neocolonialism. And to respond to your question of a while ago of like, what relevance does this book from Losurdo have, today, and as for what practical politics are we drawn from this, and to me that's the central thing is a serious, rigorous refocus on the colonial question and on colonized like perspectives, right? So like I haven't read much of a lot of the Western Marxists cited throughout the book, but I have read a fair amount of like Chinese communist literature and things like that. I've read so yeah, it's like paying attention to the aspect of the dialectic that has been ignored by Western Marxism, I guess is kind of what I'm getting at. And Badiou's Maoist like praise of the Cultural Revolution, I wanted to touch on the fact that is that doesn't do him any favors. Essentially like that split is related to the China question, right? Is whether China is capitalist or not, is where you fall on the Cultural Revolution is related to that question. And I looked it up, and he was he believes that China's capitalist now, and that they took the capitalist road. Badiou did, and said as such. And so it would make sense that he would have this post-Marxist Leninist, like, okay, well, it failed, so what do we do now? But the thing is, like, it didn't fail, right? Like, China has so far defended itself from being Yeltsined, so like yeah, it's okay. So how much weight does China throw around in BRICS, and what if it is doing Marxism? Like, are its policies based on materialist dialectics? Like, you know what I mean? Like, and to what extent are they, and where If not, where are they, right? If we can be like rigorous dialecticians, then we ought to be able to suss out whether their politics are dialectical, and that should be a good, right? So, it's like, I know I'm all over the place, but I think it's all related and tied in.
No, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I feel like, you know, a lot of Badiou stuff, I'm just going to post a link to a podcast I did with two scholars that went back and examined Badiou's 68 days, because Badiou during 68 created this kind of like outlaw Marxist-Leninist group called UCFML. I think it's like translated as like the Union of Communist Marxists Leninists France. And they had a very fascinating position that was sort of beyond Trotskyism and Maoism and so on, but was trying to unify Marxist-Leninist parties. And I thought that that was Badiou at his best, in my opinion. I'll send you the podcast. You guys can listen to it, because you see, by the time of the late 1980s, Badiou argues that the party form, as I mentioned before, is totally defunct, is now dead, and we need to theorize a completely new conception of the organization. That's why he created this thing called the organization politique. I'll send you a thing. It might be of interest. Charles, please.
Yeah, I think one thing that really bolsters Losurdo's argument is a kind of prescience. He mentions more than one place a looming war. Now he wrote this in 2017, and the appendix indicates this was all brewing well before that. And now we see a conflagration way beyond what could be imagined in 2017. I mean, we've got 2 years of war with Russia, under the aegis of a worn-out fig leaf of a rules-based order. And we've got a year of genocide in Palestine with, such shark-jumping ferocity as to unveil all Western complicity when we think about this. It's not enough just to point a finger at Israel anymore. I mean, this has been going on forever. And opened the view more than anything in forever towards the racist underpinnings of the American hyper empire to people that never would have really thought about this before. So when he talks about, a temporal and spatial amputation of the revolutionary project, which is reflected on page 207 with the fate of Western Marxism becoming a kind of beautiful soul. This is put radically in our face now, especially with climatological disaster. The very wake of capital adding insult to all this injury. I think it opens a space to really take seriously what he's talking about as anti-colonial, anti-racist blowback in a way that really does make sense, regardless of anything else we want to criticize about Losurdo's polemical characterizations of other Marxist figures. So,
yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, it would have done him a good service in the section you just quoted on the concept of the phrase, because he makes a beautiful point that even internal to the Bolsheviks, you had the same tendency. This is really a book, I think, about Marxist intellectuals, There's always been that tendency of the scholars of the pen to align with critique for critique, right? To align the ends of critique as purely just for that. And he says that affects their phraseology, which is an interesting point, because that's the whole turn to discourse. I'm surprised he doesn't mention it. But that's really like what Laclau and Mouffe and hegemony or socialist strategy is kind of about, is like how to concoct new signifiers, right? That galvanize the masses in different ways. So anyways, Conrad.
Yeah, I think I want to push back a little bit on Topeka's point about how if we look at socialism with Chinese characteristics, or really any localized iteration of socialism that might be characteristic of Eastern Marxism, how, perhaps, in a way we can't criticize it. Maybe I'm vulgarizing a bit here, but in a way we can't criticize it because, that's what they're doing and it's their perspective and so on. I mean, I think that for me, this treads uncomfortably close to the sort of logic of identity politics, right? Or kind of perspectivism, right? Certainly I understand the need to be circumspect when it comes to certain kinds of criticisms, because one of the real problems and one of the reasons why Western Marxist intellectuals have, at best, I would say something of an ambivalent reception in China, is that a lot of them trot out critiques which are influenced by negative portrayals in the Western media, or aren't made with a great deal of sensitivity to particular conditions within the country. That having been said, I think that we have to really, really be careful not to subsume the class contradiction, right? Within the frame of, say, national particularity, right? Again, I would appraise positively many of China's achievements. But, one thing that's been discussed here is the concept of labor aristocracy, and class composition. And, it is worth noting in China that, if you look at, for example, Jiang Zemin, like the theory of the three represents, right? What had essentially happened, this was in the 90s, late 90s, I think. What had essentially happened was that, because of the expansion of the market, right, you had a very large business class in China, and you had, the growth of, sort of petit bourgeois segments and so forth. And this kind of presented a certain difficulty with respect to the legitimacy of the party, because one of the party policies of the party, for example, was not to bring in business people, right? So at that point, the party actually changes itself and begins to engage in, the representation of, for example, advanced workers. So what we begin to see is, a profound shift, in the class composition of the party. And, it should be noted that today, I don't wish to overgeneralize, and I don't have statistics at my disposal, but it does seem to me that very often party membership functions as a form of status, which is in many cases more available to certain segments of the population than others in that respect. So again, I absolutely don't want to paint with one brush. I don't think that's the right thing to do. But I do think that I would not want to neutralize the critique from the standpoint of class, because of a positive recognition of certain gains that have been made with respect to the anti-imperialist contradiction, as it were. And I think actually at one point, I think Stalin at one point talking about, the notion of national Marxisms, and he says, there is no, Chinese Marxism, there is no Russian Marxism, there is neither Marxism, because, and this is actually one thing that's interesting about Stalin as well, right? As much as he employed, what Samir Amin calls delinking, right? Or the effort to, contend with the restriction of socialism to one part of the world and to practically address those circumstances, he was very, very hesitant to sort of reify it, right, into a theory of what you should do, right? So I think there's a vulgar sort of famous quip where, someone proposed to him making, Stalinism into an official doctrine, right? And he sort of shot back resentfully, about his relation to Lenin, because they said, well, why not? There's Leninism, so why not Stalinism? And he said, you're comparing a dick to a guard tower, right? The point being, in a way, that Lenin had been penetrative, right? Like, whereas all he had been trying to do was sort of defend those gains, right? And he didn't wish to label it, right? Something that was kind of ontologically salient in that sense. So, again, I think it goes back to the issue, that it would not be sufficient. Like, we have to do a better job in analyzing China. And also, I think, acknowledging the good things that have been accomplished, because there are many that have been too rarely recognized within the West. But, I think that we also want to make sure that, Marxism in the West or anywhere, is playing a progressive role, and that China has been subject to certain forms of regression, much as the whole world has, and that those deserve to be fairly and objectively critiqued.
I don't agree with that. I wish you hadn't mentioned Lenin, Conrad, for everything else that you said, because Lenin was one person who soon after the revolution decides to go, to remote villages in Russia. And why is he doing that? Because he wants to sit in on those local meetings that people are having to say that what is the face that the future is going to have for the USSR? So how can you say that it shouldn't be grounded? That's all about grounding it. There's nothing like a generalized theory. Generalized theory, if you just try to keep it as a generalized theory, it's not going to make sense. This is the opposite of what he did. So to use him as an example and say that, well, there's an example, that's the wrong example. You could have used another example. And again, I will go back to what China is doing. That I think, again, one thing that you're missing out of your discussion is where is the discussion of the anti-revolution, anti-colonial revolution, because that's exactly what Mao is talking about. What is it that they're talking about that we want to make China strong? They're not talking about wanting to make China strong in a particular way, but they're saying that enough of this humiliation, and we are going to do what we want to do. And that's part of their anti-colonial struggle and the steps that they take. Now, you might say that this is not working, with our definition of Marxism, but that's the whole thing that we've been discussing for weeks. That's exactly Losurdo's point. This is exactly what a lot of these Western Marxists are doing, which we started with, that it is shameful that how limited their perspective is on what Marxism should be. But if you look at it more broadly, they're going to do it very differently because and then we come back to the point that do we want the post-colonial entity to be a strong entity or always to be position of, that we are struggling and we'll continue with the struggle. And here's the example of the struggle. Always standing, on top of some hill without any power, but looking like, wow, you guys are brave.
There's, to be clear, there's no definition of Marxism, mine or anyone's, that excludes a consideration of the class question.
Right.
I'm not saying that we can disregard the anti-colonial question. I think it's very important. And I praise China positively in that respect. My only point about grounding is that if we're really going to do grounding, we have to go look at what's going on at the level of class as well, and we can't ignore it.
Grounding has to be within each context. You can't, otherwise, where are you grounding it? Because then you said, well, you can't ground it in Russia. Of course you need to ground it in Russia. That's exactly what Lenin is talking about. If you read his early work, if you read What Is to Be Done, his book, his tiny little book, that's exactly what he's talking about. It has to be grounded because where are you going without grounding it?
Insofar as the nation remains a crucial unit, right, of political and economic exchange, it's absolutely necessary to do that. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't fetishize the nation, right, or treat it as having some special canon of knowledge that would prevent us from adequately analyzing the class question. That's what I'm saying. I'm not opposing recognizing things at the level of nation. I'm saying that there's not fundamentally, right, a French Marxism or Chinese Marxism or Russian Marxism, right? Those are Marxisms that are playing out in the context of the state.
Yeah, but also then how can we say that the class question has been totally eliminated when they are defining themselves, as a communist country? So we are saying your definition is bullshit and we are going to define for you. So if they are defining themselves that this is who we are, unless to say that they have totally, misunderstood what communism is, whether it has anything to do with class or not.
It's not a misunderstanding. It's an outcome of history, right? When you use, the private market, right, to engender wealth that way, right? When you have this sort of cheap labor strategy, right? When you produce, all kinds of wealthy individuals, right? When you incorporate them into the party. I mean, these are changes in class relations that are decisive to the society, right? So this isn't something that's happening just at the level of a reading. I want to stress that. Anyway, I don't want to get into like a big debate about this, but because other people want to talk as well. But suffice it to say, I think that things need to be taken up at the level of the nation insofar as it has material effects. But I would be personally, I'm worried about reifying it. That's all.
Okay, let's just end it here, Daniel. Yeah.
No, very good. I mean, I think my only point would be, I don't think that anyone is suggesting some like distinct or autonomous theoretical school that would necessarily emerge based on national struggles that then needs to gain the admiration of Marxists or something like that. I don't see that happening, but perhaps in our plenary we can pick this debate back up, which I think it's a very productive one. Akshay, please.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I was thinking about these two themes, I guess, sort of purity and power. And I found, I mean, I guess the word tendency that we were bringing up a little while ago. I mean, I guess like what I find the strongest point in Losurdo's book is that he kind of identifies two tendencies. But I think I sort of agree with Conrad insofar as there isn't a, you know, I mean, I find his kind of way of resolving the question a little insufficient. But I mean, just this discussion that we were having a second ago, like, I mean, if you think about communism as the real movement in history towards the abolition of capitalism, like, I mean, there would be no one position from which we would know Marxism or communism. You know, there would be its sort of splitting as it emerged as, and I think Deepika is right to say that as a real historical process, wherever Marxist thought would travel, or if not travel, say, be spontaneously rediscovered, there would be a translation. But simultaneously, that translation wouldn't be so culturally specific that, you know, I mean, it does seem that in every single case, we see the same question of world system, class, right? And even wherever we have kind of the communist revolution, there's always the problem of like capitalist restoration, right? Like kind of like the question remains of like kind of what are the tendencies animating the state, right? Like, and who in fact does finally control the state? And I mean, you know, the state, in order to exist, having to sort of like have the patronage of various kind of, you know, other classes. Like, I mean, in the sense that, I mean, I think that gets back to this kind of purity and power question, where I think like, I agree with Losurdo in so much as, you know, I know like in Hyderabad, actually, the communists in 2014 basically engineered the victory of a state government and then refused to take power because they were like, you know, that's not what we do. But on the other hand, like there is this, you know, as far as when we're looking at China, I think, you know, we have to ask all of these questions sort of about capitalist restoration. I mean, in Losurdo's text in particular, I guess like there's this strange oscillation about this question of, you know, he says that, Marx sort of doesn't get it because he thinks that the bourgeois order sort of like internal to itself, you know, would sort of achieve liberal freedom. And I think this is kind of like a misreading of Marx, like in the sense that I think Marx sort of does read it as a precisely a split process that does reveal its kind of true barbaric face. And I guess the corollary of that is I found that when trying to justify this, like Losurdo kind of reaches back to, I think, sort of anachronistic examples of colonialism. And I found the most lacking part of the book was a sort of like contemporary analysis of a colonial question, which I think would bring us squarely kind of, you know, into, I don't know, some kind of contemporary discussion. Anyway, I'm sorry. I don't know if that
Yeah.
made
So,
sense, but I'll stop there.
okay. Thank you so much. I mean, I think that he's very correct to take on Hart and Negri in the Empire series and the implicit claim that they make that all of these, like, you know, Serbia or Palestine are ultimately sort of aberrations, and that we're approaching this kind of you know, even like they invoke like the Kantian kingdom in Kant's like perpetual peace essay, right? That this is sort of the new Pax Liberal Americana order is sort of post-imperialist. And Losurdo's example is NATO's military interventions, which persist, Palestine, and then a whole scattered array of Cold War interventions, which still have reverberations insofar as the U.S. Imperial war machine still oversees all of those territories. And that Marxists don't formulate their praxis off of these anti-colonial exceptions, which are still there, even though they're not the rule, they're the exception. So he takes on David Harvey in this regard and says ultimately David Harvey is basically neutering the true status of imperialism. Although I myself, I would want to hear a defender, because Losurdo does make a strong historical demonstration about, and even I found it kind of funny him saying, yes, we had to Hannah Arendt's origins of totalitarianism is falsely pinpointing it in fascism and then Stalinism and so on, when in reality its origins were in the maintenance of the early colonial system itself, right? Stretching back even to pre-American Revolution, he was using examples of, right? So that's this notion of like counter history that he's trying to put forward. But I think another thing he's trying to say is that the counter history framework of Losurdo is one of the devices for the rebirth of Western Marxism, I would say. And I think actually you could make a claim through his case studies, say even of Nietzsche, the proof is in the pudding there, right? Because the left Nietzscheans have not been able to recover from his intervention on Nietzsche. That's just a fact. And I don't think that they will. So there is something intrinsically robust, let's say, regarding his historiography that is very powerful. Eric, please. You are muted. I apologize. Good.
Thank you. Following up on what Charles said, I don't think you can underestimate the degree to which capitalism is an inherently self-contradictory system and inherently conflict-ridden. So sort of the questions, about the revolutionary potential of the working class and such, and who is the revolutionary agent. I mean, the theorizations dating to the 1960s, when capitalism was arguably in full flower and, a successful world system, necessarily extend far into the future. I mean, I thought that the Marxists believed that originally that capitalism can't survive really because it's the law of value ends up being totally contradictory to itself, and it's going to go into crisis. And as Charles says, I mean, the crisis might not come as a purely economic commiseration or unemployment, but it can come out of war and climate disasters itself will most likely be the impetus for the future politics in whatever form it takes. But things are going to change quickly, eventually. And on Losurdo, I just wanted to say that Losurdo says that the bifurcation between Eastern Marxism and Western Marxism comes down to a contrast between Marxists who exercise power and Marxists who are in opposition. Okay, and then Perry Anderson, in his book on Western Marxism, made the distinction between a Marxism that was rooted in history, historical materialism, and political economy, and theorized, as he says, with the newspapers on the table, on the desk, and those that did not. And I'm sorry that that Anderson said that there was a traditional Marxism rooted in history and political economy, but Western Marxism starts with philosophy. It is rooted in, it's basically philosophical. Now, Anderson posits as the alternative to this kind of Marxism, Trotskyism, as being true to that ideal of history, political economy, and theorizing. And I think Losurdo, who wants to defend seems to defend Stalinism as a necessary, given the circumstances faced by the Soviet Union, doesn't allude to the Trotskyist critique of Stalinism, which is not something that comes out of philosophy. And you can't say that Trotsky did not wield power. I mean, he was very familiar with power. And yet, in that situation, he produces and others with him, produces a very cogent historical materialist analysis of what's wrong with a critique of Stalinism that takes into account all the necessities of the situation impinging on the Soviet Union, but nevertheless shows how it produces, an undesirable authoritarian, at least, if not totalitarian situation, which is not based, which is not saying is the same as Nazi Germany. It's very different, but so I find that he doesn't. And there was a crucial development in Marxism itself, that type of analysis of Soviet Union. So
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the Bolsheviks became and theorized the longest duration of revolutionary theorist Marxist intellectual leadership than had ever before been done, meaning that they knew about Marxist theory of Bonapartism so in depth that they tried to theorize which amongst them will become Bonapartist and how to mitigate that, right? So the Bolsheviks, I think, in a certain way, give us the petri dish for a type of intellectual that immediately after their success becomes in abeyance or is absent to the Western intellectual. And that then becomes the source of the profound romanticization, especially of Trotsky, because Trotsky's narrative itself is alluring to intellectuals and has been more for baby boomer intellectuals, I think, precisely because he was a literary theorist, an autodidact. He was a military general. He didn't go to West Point or anything like that. He taught himself military tactics. It's unheard of things, right? So you get a sense of a comprehensive figure of the revolutionary. And so that's actually one of the things that interests me about Western Marxism, which is every intellectual produces a prototype of what an intellectual could be, from the implications of their praxis, That's another reason why everyone should read Isabel Garro, because Isabel Garro shows that's really since the 1980s, we have had the production of intellectuals in the West largely off of two thinkers that are not mentioned in this text, but Laclau and Mouffe. And she thinks that that's problematic because what that renders the Marxist intellectual's task to be is basically to be a kind of marketing agent for activism in a certain way and a sloganeer creator in a certain way. I mean, think about the movement of 2011 that we talked about earlier. It was driven by that very Gen X sloganeering idea of kind of like, let's capture even 1% versus the 99%, was cast under the understanding, in my view, that the population, the masses, don't have the stomach for the portrayal of the class struggle as Marx understood it. So they adopted a populist understanding. But that's what Laclau was saying. That was Laclau's prescription, So that's what I think this question about slogans and all of this stuff at the end. Matilda, please go.
I feel like my overall picture that kind of got developed after reading this was like, you had the global system of the world market form, and it just happened that the Europeans were like at the head of it, and the United States seemed to have like quickly gotten into like the leadership of like the main capital holders, and that yes, there's imperialism, and like I kind of like refreshed myself on Lenin, the imperialism thesis, and like I came to basically the same conclusion as the Harvey section. I was like, oh gosh, like wow, I just like read Lenin and I came up with like the Harvey hypothesis in a way. That like everyone has to be an imperialist because that's just like we're in the phase of monopoly capitalism, and if you want to compete and have a business that's substantial, you have to like compete as like a monopoly imperialist and like opening up other markets. And then I think in my studies of Marxism, I've avoided the how colonialism and slavery like is incorporated into the system. So like my understanding, I feel like now is like you have the world market, and the countries that like controlled it developed this intense ideology, like the racial ideology that allowed them to like basically like not complete the bourgeois revolution in some way, and like maintain colonialism and slavery. And I also got the sense from Losurdo that even if socialism fails, as long as it was like a national liberation struggle and a struggle, an anti-colonial struggle, that like it had a positive effect in the fight of capitalism. And I feel like the part, and like that actually makes sense, you know, if colonialism and slavery are like a part of capitalism, like if the revolution like frees these people from colonialism, like that is a strike against capitalism. It might increase the contradictions of the world system, in a way, increasing competition for everybody. But it breaks the slave owners like hold. But and the last thing I wanted to say was like China, I think the interesting point he had about the humanism and how to read the Cultural Revolution and the Communist Manifesto was the Chinese like, and I think Marx in the Communist Manifesto like saw that one would have to develop the productive forces as strongly as possible, both in order to free yourself from colonialism, but also to compete on the world market as a business. But that would also create a thread through the world of interdependence, like with China now, like it has such like a material thread that it has woven throughout the world with its industry that it's like created an internationalism or prepares the way for some sort of like planetary perspective or something.
Yeah. I mean, I felt one thing we didn't talk about, right, is that he touches on this like trinity of, although that's probably the wrong word given his critique of religion, of how the struggle for political emancipation played out historically, unlike this idea of, oh, well, it's all bourgeois dispensations that grant rights. That's maybe like the Hannah Arendt view. No, but in reality, it's workers, women, and the colonized that proved that these battles for recognition that they were the source for the achievement of those rights, and that this exceptional theory of imperialism, this post-imperialist conception, has the risk of completely shutting down what the function of the philosopher, or you could say the intellectual, must be, which is to open the space for the reigniting of those forms of recognition struggle. Now, I think the elephant in the room, right, as far as I can tell, is how are we then to take and theorize recognition struggles in the heart of the belly of the beast, you know, as a struggle for the reconfiguration of the workers' movement. That's less clear to me in reading this text. What is clear to me, and has been very helpful to me, is this idea of the refusal of this, you know, workerist reduction that would push away the imperialist struggle as kind of non-existent or secondary. But still, I still want to know how this humanistic struggle can, I wonder if others have thought about that. I'll just leave it at that. Aaron, you've been waiting for a minute. Welcome, please.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief because I know that we're at the end, and I know that I wanted to make a comment kind of about the conversation that Deepika and Conrad were having, not so much from my own perspective, but kind of situating it in Losurdo's kind of tact or his oeuvre in some ways. So I'll just try and keep it really brief, which is that I think what Deepika and Conrad were saying resonates with me about the kind of necessity of placing, for instance, the Chinese experiment with socialism within its historical context, and that I'm completely on board with, insofar as not upholding or not holding it up to a kind of abstract ideal of Marxism, which is, I think, what Losurdo's critique of Western Marxists is that they kind of they've jumped to this fourth stage. They have this sort of utopian notion of what Marxism itself is, let alone communism, and then they're holding up the kind of actually existing struggles to that. So that's well taken. But what I wanted to say, and to kind of situate it within what I see as Losurdo's work, which I said a couple of weeks ago, like I read Losurdo as kind of a person that demystifies the things that we take for granted in our kind of intellectual world. And I think that I'm kind of bastardizing it, I'm sure, a little bit, Deepika, but I'm uncomfortable with the kind of notion that there's a way in which grounding the kind of, say, Chinese struggle in the kind of material conditions in the historical moment that it emerged from slips into a kind of deference that I'm uncomfortable with. And I think that's why Conrad's point about identity politics is well taken. Insofar as, Deepika, you said something like, well, this is what they say it is. They say it's Marxism. They say it's communism. And we kind of have to defer to them because it emerged out of a specifically Chinese context. It emerged out of a very particular international context. And I think with that point, to set my own views about it aside, I think that I'm worried because I don't think that's what Losurdo would want us to do. For instance, Losurdo's other work about sort of demystifying the liberal project, right, is there's a way in which if you asked kind of Western liberals about what their project is, I don't think that any of us would be comfortable deferring to what they themselves say it is, because this is essentially what they do, right? In the Constitution, we have this thing about the more perfect union. And so liberals could very easily say, well, you know, all that bad stuff was kind of, we can historicize it and say that it happened then. And it was just us kind of moving through the historical process. And we're moving towards it on our own road to this kind of liberal ideal. And I don't think Losurdo would accept that. And I think that for us to accept that with sort of Chinese communism, we have to then ask why. Why would we accept it in the one case and not accept it in the other? And I think that the first answer is that, oh, well, they're communists, and so they're kind of on our side, and it's this kind of Manichaean thing, which I find to be sort of unhelpful. Or it's something kind of grosser, which is a kind of chauvinism or fetishism about, like, you know, this Orientalist ideal of sort of those people in the East and they're figuring it out, and we kind of have to. So I don't know. I just like, I don't really know what I'm saying, except that I find that slip to be difficult in terms of, like, yes, grounding it in the material conditions, but sort of not excusing it as only that, because I don't think that that's what Losurdo does in his work in terms of unpacking sort of any ideological content or a project, so to speak. So I don't know if that makes sense, but for me, it raised those questions about how we kind of situate this within Losurdo's greater oeuvre. I don't know if that makes sense to other people.
Daniel, can I respond? Because then I want to get off. It's 9:15.
Absolutely.
I just respond. So this is what I was thinking and what I was trying to respond to, because Losurdo makes it very clear, you know, that the colonial or the anti-colonial struggle he considers that as part of, Marxist struggles. It's because it is against a whole form of life, which is not only just then defined as workers, right? Because if you think about anti-colonial struggles, it's not just workers, it's the workers and the bourgeoisie, and it's a whole bunch of people. So I think that's where probably you might be looking at it differently than I am. And this is not about, they are defining it. So let's just take any definition from them. But what is the starting of this discussion? If the start of this discussion is that, as Mao said it, right, that it was an anti-colonial struggle that he had begun the process of. And after his passing away, then the leadership that came after that, what did they say? They said, we are not going to experience that humiliation ever again. And we are moving forward from here. And we are going to make China the strongest country. And they're not talking about moving away from a communist framework. But within that, what they do is what you're saying. Well, that doesn't sound very communist. And to some degree, yeah, it doesn't sound very communist, but it sounds anti-colonial. Right? So that's the thing. So I think there's a lot of terminology going around here. And Losurdo is the first person I'm seeing who's really bringing it in a very productive way, in a way that actually even a lot of post-colonialists don't do. So this is, I think, what's important about what he's presenting, the way I have absorbed it. So this is not about identity politics, because that will really take us in a very different direction. I don't think he's trying to do that. And I'm not saying that he's doing that. But what he is trying to suggest, and the way I'm reading this, is that this was part of their anti-colonial struggle. And part of it was to make China strong. And I've already talked about it, which is reflecting what Losurdo is saying, that Marxism shouldn't only be this place of victimhood, and especially in the third world. Where is the strength of the third world? So you're seeing it in China, but then there are pieces of it that you say, well, that doesn't look like, communism, but it looks like a state that came out of its victimhood. In order to do that, it did all these other things within a Chinese so-called, which is what I'm calling Chinese communist framework, which is then what I'm calling, is that these are the characteristics of Chinese communism, right? And this comes under the rubric of an anti-colonial struggle. So there are layers and layers to it. It's not just one thing. So yeah, so you still don't have to accept it, but this is where I was coming from.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Conrad.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
So lots of good points, I think, made by both speakers in that debate. And I think that people in this chat may occupy slightly different positions, with respect to the class versus the imperialist contradiction. But I think what we can see the more we discuss is that I don't think there's a fundamental divergence in the ideas being put forth there. But I think what is also important to stress, as well as the fact that these contradictions, are separable to a point, is their interrelation, right? So this goes back to, if you look at what Amin says about the French Empire versus, what we might construe as the Soviet Empire. I don't know how you wish to describe that, the Eastern Bloc or whatever. And what he, essentially points out is that, the process of consolidation, whereby the Soviets were able to retain a lot of parts of the Russian Empire, right? Not just through martial struggle, but through, even more importantly, distributing wealth in such a way that they're actually helping, right, those regions, right, sending wealth from Moscow, to relatively peripheral areas. That was essential to the preservation of that bloc, and that France, for instance, couldn't have done that, right? It couldn't have, equalized wealth throughout its empire in the same way within the context of the capitalist mode of production, right? Because of the pressures exerted by the rate of profit, because of the depth of business interests, and so forth. In other words, it was precisely the achievement of socialism that allowed for the retention of that bloc, right? And I think this is very, very important because what it shows you is the link between domestic politics, right? Revolution and its outcome, and the kinds of international politics that get play, right? So if you look at, a lot of socialist states, I don't think they've been anywhere near as martially aggressive as a lot of Western states. Within the Soviet Union, there were efforts to arm different anti-colonial struggles. When they entered Afghanistan, that was done at the request of a government that was supported by the majority of the population, right? In order to fight extremist fragments. And I think they were requested something like 60 times to join before they ultimately did, because there was a real, hesitancy in the sense that they worried that their intervention would delegitimize, right, the actual government there and what it was going through. And to some extent, that is certainly what we saw. If you look at China, they have not had, I would say, a significant military altercation since 1949. We can talk about little things, right? Their 1 week dispute with Vietnam, right? Their intervention in the Korean War. But again, nothing akin to what we see with the imperialist powers. So I think that on the whole, we can say that, what has been the case is that it's been the class character of these societies, right? In the way that they're not, relying on a highly exploitative mode of imperialism in that way, that has allowed them to function differently with international affairs. And one thing that tells us is that whether it's under the aegis of ideological socialism or capitalism or anything else, if a state were to drift too strongly in the direction of capitalization, right, and the unlimited play of the private sector, as it developed, I would think it would be, and as the relative value of its labor units went up, I think it would be inevitable. And someone else alluded to this, that it would begin to recapitulate and adopt, martial imperialist behaviors. Again, right now we can see a big difference, right? Like even if you look at Africa, right? The West goes in like, with the, horrific invasion of Libya, for example, and will use military force, right, in order to knock off leaders and impose its will. Whatever one can say about Chinese engagement, it doesn't have that kind of martial recourse. In other words, the agreements that they're reaching are agreements that are being reached on diplomatic terms with governments there, and that are often being accepted because they're vastly preferable to those that are being proposed by the West, which has shown recourse to military force. So again, I think we have to look at the way that class questions are linked with anti-imperialism in that way.
I think that's good too. Also, the point that he makes that the pre-civil rights movement was driven by communist agitators, outside agitators, right? Not exclusively, but it was a significant, causal dimension to taking on white supremacy, right? And so I do think that socialism as construed, because a lot of like vulgar liberal theories of socialism would take these three forms of struggle and say socialism is only applicable to the first one, to workers, but not to women. And Losurdo's trying to reverse that. That's why I trust him more than I would like a Jason Stanley when we make these linkages between the Third Reich and the Jim Crow South and reactionary American politics and so on. Like that picture resonates with me, and it actually, there's a certain logic to it. And I think what Conrad is therefore saying is that socialist revolution will produce nation states that are forced to be imperialistic, but there's something, and I'm not sure exactly how we might theorize this, but there is something somehow less Machiavellian or less instrumentalist.
Well, I just want to say it's very simple. Like, if you look at France, wealth was going from Algeria to France, right? If you look at the Soviet Union, wealth is going from Moscow to the Caucasus, right? So it's not based on the exploitation of periphery by the core in that way, right? It might be based on the defense of, political and geographic interests, right? In that sense, or, as a desire for political expansion. But the fundamental motivation and the way it relates to the rate of profit is not the same.
So you're saying that arrangement is one of the best predictors of the intensity of imperialist violence? versus
What I'm saying is that, you know, when you have the abolition of capitalism, when you have the abolition of private interest,
Mhm.
right? That what it appears to beget and what we've seen are, you know, geographical structures, right, or political structures, which are not based on the marginalization of a periphery, right, and the exploitation of it. You know, and like, you know, in that basis, if you were to examine China today, you could say that, you know, their international relations are in some respects as ambiguous as their internal economy. But of course, nothing like the sort of extremity and martial intervention that we see in the West.
I think that's fair, but I also think that Losurdo's theory of liberalism also posits, right, that there are reactionary discourses intellectually that make up the mainstream of liberalism, which themselves give fodder or justification to genocidal activity, extreme racist subjugation, excessive violence, and so on.
Oh, sure. I'm not eliminating the discursive side. Like all of this plays out ideologically in a very palpable way as well.
Okay. Thanks for these interventions. And I think our final comment will be from Colin, unless anyone else wants to jump in. I know I've kept you guys for a bit. Please.
Can you hear me okay?
Try again. Yeah, you're good.
Yep. Yeah, I've been a little silent because I'm on very little sleep and I've been grading papers all day. I've been trying to go through a stack of 165 papers over break, which is quite a lot. So something I've been thinking about throughout this book, this how can be reborn chapter is one I looked at a couple of times. Is this theme of recognition that sort of takes from Hegel. And so he says here in the last page on 234, the last paragraph, a second sentence, indeed, the excommunication inflicted by Western Marxism on Eastern Marxism has resulted not in the end of the excommunicated party, but of the excommunicator. So in trying to discredit and destroy Eastern Marxism, Western Marxism has destroyed itself. And I think this goes back to at the beginning of the book, where Losurdo talks about this struggle of recognition between two Marxisms. Because there are two Marxisms with different aims. There's the Marxism developed in the West, which has the aim, if I may depart from Losurdo just a little bit, but I think a point that you would agree with, it has the aim of revolutionary defeatist struggle against the imperialism which it occupies, and then the anti-colonial revolution, which has the aim of achieving independence, having state power, creating wealth for the disenfranchised nation. And something I noticed, I thought about here too, is that in the struggle for recognition in Hegel's phenomenology, in paragraph 180, it says that self-consciousness, when it encounters another self-consciousness, Hegel's talking about two consciousnesses coming into contact with each other, that in this life and death struggle that ensues, that the self-consciousness has to sublate the otherness of itself to become certain of itself as the essential being. And in so doing, it sublates its own self because the other is itself. And so I think that is very much like the dialectical move that's being brought in here from Hegel. And I think that, you know, probably people who read this section, Hegel closely, have noticed it, but I wanted to bring it up to everyone's attention. Anyways, so.
No, that's very useful, I think, in a certain sense, because that is obviously related to a very strange, I mean, I think we've tried to pinpoint in our discussion where this utopian and messianic temporality sort of emerges from. I think we've tried to add more meat on the bones of this implicit theory of petty bourgeois ideology, which is something I get deeply into with Rockgill. But I think you're also right. Well, I mean, at the same time, while I agree with you, Colin, I don't want to think the dialectic of recognition as internal to intellectuals, right? So it's like, and I'm not suggesting you're doing that, but I do think that one of the claims of the book is that you need what Losurdo calls, what is it, like a multiplicity of temporalities. Marxism requires touching all four temporalities that we are outlined before. it cannot survive if it's only in this like fourth quadrant of like the near future and the utopian future, but not in the quadrant of the transition from bourgeois form of emancipation. And it's like that is where Eastern Marxism is. Eastern Marxism is in that experimental space of the transition. However you deem or ultimately judge where they land on that, they have to be contended with in order for the vitality of any Marxism to stand on its own 2 feet, I would say. But yeah, it's really good. Charles, for an encore point, please.
I was glad that Colin brought that up. I know, Daniel, you brought up recognition last time, even as a preliminary to the conversation, and I think Connor brought it up. But I've been thinking a lot about it, and I think that I don't know if we're going to meet again. I hope people will think about this question of recognition and how it impinges for, both Losurdo and, I'm trying to catch up on my Marx. I'm neck deep in the Grundrisse, and I'm amazed at the level of Hegel that is involved in that text. So I'm having a hard time understanding a Marxism that would de-emphasize that Hegelian element of recognition, because recognition seems to go to the question of totality, given that Geist shows itself as the mutuality of recognition in the phenomenology. And I mean, it seems an indispensable feature of any dialectic. I mean, even insofar as moments, or, as Marx will call them in the Grundrisse, dynamai, or a find actuality, or energia, and anyway, a manifestation of an original synthetic living unity, in Hegelian terms. Marx seems clearly focused on the recognition of capital as a vampiric, alienated reflection of living labor. And there seems to be a revolutionary demand for this recognition. And I think, even if Losurdo beats a dead horse at times, I think it's justified insofar as we've forgotten and failed to recognize this anti-colonial and anti-racist struggle. And I don't know. The theory of this whole business about recognition, I think, is really central to this, and I hope people will think about it.
Thanks. That's very useful. Excellent work, everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed our sessions. I certainly did. Yeah, I mean, I think we gave the text a fair hearing, and I'm happy with the outcome. I'll let y'all know in the Discord and over email, like when our plenary discussion session may happen with Rockhill. But really, really grateful to everyone, and we did it. We did it pretty quick. It was pretty cool. I learned a lot. Hope y'all did too. Have an excellent night.
Thanks, Daniel. Really informative.
Thanks, everyone.